The morning I found the neon orange violation notice stapled to my front door. I was carrying 2 bags of groceries and trying not to spill my coffee. My name is Peter Vaughn, and I had lived in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision in suburban Atlanta, Georgia, for exactly 8 months. The notice flapped in the April breeze like some kind of bureaucratic surrender flag, and I already knew it was going to ruin my day. I set down the groceries on my porch and pulled the paper free. The letter was printed on official HOA letterhead, complete with a little logo of a house with a sun rising behind it. How cheerful. The message was anything but. Violation notice. Unauthorized placement of propane tank visible from street. Per HOA Covenant Section 4.7, all utility equipment must be screened from public view. Fine, $500. Compliance required within 7 days or additional fines will apply. I stared at the paper, reading it 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. My propane tank. The one that fueled my grill. The standard 20-pound cylinder that was sitting on the side of my house, tucked against the brick wall where I thought it would be unobtrusive. That propane tank, $500. I crumpled the notice in my fist and looked up and down my quiet suburban street. Every house looked almost identical to mine. Beige siding with brick accents, 2-car garages, professionally landscaped yards. I had moved here from a small apartment in Buckhead thinking I was upgrading my life. Now I was being fined for a propane tank. The groceries could wait. I pulled out my phone and dialed the HOA office number printed at the bottom of the notice. It rang 4 times before someone picked up. Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. This is Brenda speaking. Hi, Brenda. My name is Peter Vaughn. I just received a violation notice about a propane tank and I think there has been a mistake. There was a pause, then the sound of typing. What is your address, Mr. Vaughn? I gave her my house number on Sycamore Lane. More typing. Yes, I have the file right here. The violation was reported by our board president, Mrs. Patricia Tennyson, during her neighborhood inspection on Monday. She noted the propane tank was clearly visible from the street and constitutes a violation of Section 4.7. It's a grill propane tank, I said, trying to keep my voice level. It's maybe 2 feet tall and it's against the side of my house. You can barely see it. I understand your concern, Mr. Vaughn, but the covenants are very clear. All utility equipment must be properly screened. You can build a small enclosure or move the tank to your backyard where it won't be visible from the street. I rubbed my temple. And the $500 fine. That will be assessed if you don't come into compliance within 7 days. Can I appeal this? Another pause. You can request a hearing with the board. The next meeting is in 2 weeks, on the 23rd. 2 weeks, but I only have 7 days to fix this. You would still need to come into compliance by the deadline, Mr. Vaughn. The hearing would be to discuss the fine and any extenuating circumstances. I thanked her and hung up, though I wanted to throw my phone into the street. Instead, I grabbed my groceries and went inside. My golden retriever, Max, greeted me at the door with his usual enthusiasm, completely oblivious to the injustice of HOA politics. I put away the groceries and went out back to look at my yard. It was a decent-sized lot, maybe a 1/4 acre, with a wooden privacy fence surrounding it. The backyard was where I kept my actual propane grill, a nice stainless steel model I had bought myself as a housewarming gift. The tank in question was on the side of the house, because I kept a spare there for convenience. When one ran out, I could swap them quickly without having to run to the store in the middle of cooking. Moving it to the backyard seemed simple enough, but it annoyed me on principle. Nobody could see the tank unless they were specifically looking for it. Someone had to have walked right up to the side of my house to spot it. This Patricia Tennyson person must have been conducting quite the thorough inspection. I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. I had mostly kept to myself since moving in, focusing on settling into my new job as a software developer at a tech company in Alpharetta. I worked from home 3 days a week, which meant I was around the neighborhood more than some people, but I still did not know many of my neighbors. As I walked down Sycamore Lane, I started paying attention to details I had previously ignored. 3 houses down, the Johnsons had a decorative garden gnome that had to be at least 3 feet tall. 2 streets over on Maple Drive, someone had painted their front door a deep burgundy instead of the approved colors listed in the HOA guidelines I had received when I bought the house. I turned onto Oak Boulevard and saw several houses with basketball hoops mounted over their garage doors, trash cans left visible beside houses, and one property with a small boat parked in the driveway. None of these homes had orange violation notices on their doors. I was starting to get a clearer picture of how things worked around here. Selective enforcement. My propane tank was barely visible, but it had earned me a $500 fine while more obvious violations went unnoticed, or more likely, unreported. When I got back home, I decided to do some research. I pulled out the thick folder of HOA documents I had received at closing. I had skimmed them back then, mostly focusing on the monthly fee amount and any major restrictions. Now, I read through the covenants more carefully. Section 4.7 did indeed state that utility equipment must be screened from view. But as I read further, I found something interesting in Section 2.3. It outlined the procedures for violation notices, including a requirement that homeowners receive a written warning for first-time violations before any fines could be assessed. This was my first violation. I had never received a warning. I grabbed my phone and called the HOA office again. Brenda answered on the second ring. Meadowbrook Heights HOA. Brenda, it's Peter Vaughn again. I've been reading through the covenants and I noticed Section 2.3 requires a written warning before fines can be issued for first-time violations. This is my first violation, but the notice I received went straight to a fine. There was silence on the other end. Then typing. Let me pull up your file again. I waited, feeling a small surge of satisfaction. Maybe I had found a way out of this ridiculous fine. Mr. Vaughn, according to our records, you were sent a written warning about the propane tank 3 weeks ago. No, I wasn't. I never received any warning. It was sent via regular mail to your address on March 28th. I never got it. And even if you sent it, 3 weeks ago would have been enough time for me to fix the issue. Why would you fine me now? The warning stated you had 14 days to comply. When our president did her inspection on Monday, the tank was still there, hence the fine. I felt my frustration building. I'm telling you, I never received any warning letter. This is the first I'm hearing about any problem with my propane tank. I can only tell you what's in our records, Mr. Vaughn. Perhaps you should attend the board meeting on the 23rd to discuss this matter. I hung up without saying goodbye. This was quickly spiraling from a minor annoyance into a real problem. $500 was a significant amount of money, and I was not about to pay it for a violation I had never been warned about. Over the next few days, I moved the propane tank to my backyard. It seemed easier to comply with the rule while I fought the fine. I took photographs of the new location, documenting that I had addressed the violation within the 7-day window. Then, I started preparing for the board meeting. I researched HOA law in Georgia and found that homeowners associations were subject to state regulations about notice requirements and due process. The lack of a proper warning could potentially invalidate the fine. I printed out relevant statutes and highlighted the pertinent sections. I also documented every conversation I'd had with Brenda, including dates and times. The week before the board meeting, I received another letter from the HOA. This one informed me that my fine had been increased to $750 due to continued non-compliance and failure to respond to previous notices. I called Brenda immediately. "I moved the tank," I said as soon as she answered. "I moved it 5 days ago. I took pictures." "How can you say I'm still in non-compliance? Mr. Vaughn, you need to calm down." "I am calm. I'm also confused about why my fine increased when I fixed the problem." More typing. "I see here that Mrs. Tennyson conducted another inspection yesterday. She noted that while the tank has been moved, there is now an issue with your trash bins being visible from the street." My trash bins. What does that have to do with the propane tank? It's a separate violation. The fine structure is cumulative for multiple violations. I walked to my front window and looked out at my driveway. My trash and recycling bins were sitting beside my garage, exactly where they had been since I moved in. Exactly where everyone else's bins were on my street. "Those bins have been there for 8 months, I said slowly. "Why are they suddenly a problem?" "I'm just reading what's in the system, Mr. Vaughn. You'll have to take it up with the board at the meeting." I marked April 23rd on my calendar with a red X. 2 weeks felt like an eternity. During that time, I tried to learn more about Patricia Tennyson and the HOA board. I discovered that Patricia had been the board president for 6 years. She lived in one of the larger homes on the northern edge of the subdivision, a 2-story colonial with professional landscaping and a 3-car garage. I drove past her house one evening and saw that she had a massive decorative fountain in her front yard, at least 6 feet tall with multiple tiers. I checked the covenants again. Section 5.2 stated that yard decorations could not exceed 4 feet in height without board approval. Interesting. I also learned that the HOA board consisted of 5 members. Patricia as president, a vice president named Douglas Miller, a secretary named Karen Whitmore, and 2 members at large, Richard Stone and Jennifer Park. I looked up their addresses in the neighborhood directory and drove past each of their houses. Douglas had a storage shed in his backyard that was clearly visible from the side street. Karen had a mailbox that did not match the approved styles listed in the guidelines. Richard had solar panels on his roof that the covenants technically required approval for. Jennifer's house seemed fine, until I noticed her house numbers were a decorative script instead of the required plain numerals. Every single board member had at least one violation of the HOA covenants. None of them had orange notices on their doors. The night of April 23rd arrived. The board meeting was held at the subdivision clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood pool and tennis courts. I arrived 15 minutes early with my folder of documentation, ready to present my case. The clubhouse was set up with a long table at the front where the board members sat, and rows of folding chairs for residents. I was surprised to see about 30 people in attendance. Apparently, I was not the only one with grievances. Patricia Tennyson sat in the center of the board table. She was exactly what I expected. A woman in her mid-50s with expertly highlighted blonde hair, wearing a navy blazer over a white blouse. She had the kind of pinched expression that suggested she found most things in life disappointing. Karen Whitmore sat to her right, a somewhat younger woman with dark hair pulled into a severe bun. The meeting started with Patricia calling things to order and reading through various administrative updates. Pool hours for the summer. Landscaping bids for the common areas. A vote on new playground equipment. Finally, she moved to the violations section of the agenda. We have several homeowners who have requested to speak about recent violation notices, Patricia said, looking down at a paper in front of her. First up is Mr. Peter Vaughn. I stood and walked to the front, folder in hand. Thank you for hearing me. I received a violation notice about a propane tank on April 11th, along with a $500 fine. I have several issues with this notice. Patricia's expression did not change. Go ahead, Mr. Vaughn. First, according to Section 2.3 of our covenants, first-time violations should receive a written warning before any fines are assessed. I never received a warning. The HOA claims a warning was sent on March 28th, but I have no record of receiving it. Second, even after I moved the tank to comply with the rule, my fine was increased to $750 based on a new alleged violation of my trash bins being visible. Those bins have been in the same location since I moved in 8 months ago with no issues. This appears to be selective enforcement. I opened my folder and pulled out my documentation. I have photographs showing the original tank location, which was minimally visible from the street. I also have photos of multiple other properties in the neighborhood with more obvious violations that have not been cited. Garden decorations over the height limit, non-compliant mailboxes, visible storage sheds, even your own front fountain misses. Tennyson appears to exceed the 4-foot height restriction in Section 5.2. A murmur went through the audience. Patricia's face flushed slightly. Mr. Vaughn, this is not a forum for you to attack board members. I'm not attacking anyone. I'm pointing out that the enforcement of these rules appears to be arbitrary and inconsistent. I'm asking that my fine be waived since I never received proper warning, and I have since corrected the issue. Douglas Miller, the vice president, leaned forward. The warning was sent via regular mail to your address. If you did not receive it, that's a postal service issue, not an HOA issue. Then I'd like to see proof that it was sent. A copy of the letter or a postal receipt. Douglas and Patricia exchanged glances. We don't keep copies of every warning letter we send out, Patricia said. So you have no proof that you actually sent it. Are you calling us liars, Mr. Vaughn? This came from Karen Whitmore, her voice sharp. I'm saying that without proof of mailing, you can't enforce a fine based on non-compliance with a warning I never received. Georgia HOA law requires proper notice before penalties can be assessed. I could see I was not making friends, but I had researched my position thoroughly. The law was on my side. Richard Stone, one of the at-large members, spoke up. What about the trash bins? What about them? They've been there since I moved in. Why are they suddenly a violation now, and why is nobody else on my street being cited for the same thing? Patricia shuffled some papers. Mr. Vaughn, we appreciate you bringing your concerns to the board. We will take your request under advisement and respond in writing within 10 business days. That's it. I'm still supposed to pay $750. Until we make a determination, yes. If we rule in your favor, you'll be refunded. I wanted to argue more, but the other homeowners were waiting their turn. I returned to my seat, frustrated but not defeated. The legal route was still available if the board did not rule fairly. The meeting continued with other homeowners presenting their grievances. A woman complained about being fined for a wreath on her front door that was up past the March 1st deadline. A man contested a fine for having his garage door open during the day. Another couple was being cited for unauthorized landscaping changes because they had planted different flowers in their front bed. It became clear that Patricia and Karen were the driving forces behind most of the violation notices. They spoke about maintaining property values and preserving the neighborhood aesthetic. They talked about rules being rules and everyone knowing what they signed up for when they bought here. By the end of the meeting, not a single fine had been overturned. I drove home feeling defeated. This was not about property values or neighborhood aesthetics. This was about control. Patricia Tennyson had created a little fiefdom where she could dictate how people lived in their own homes, and she clearly enjoyed the power. The next morning, I decided to take a different approach. If the HOA wanted to play hardball with rules, I would read every single word of the covenants and bylaws to find any leverage I could. I spent an entire Saturday going through the documents page by page. Most of it was standard HOA boilerplate about architectural review processes, common area maintenance, and assessment collection. But buried in Section 12.8, I found something interesting. The section dealt with HOA property and infrastructure. It detailed what the association owned and maintained: the clubhouse, pool, tennis courts, entrance monuments, and common area landscaping. It also included a provision about emergency equipment. The association shall maintain adequate emergency backup power systems for essential facilities, including the clubhouse communications hub and security systems. Said emergency systems shall be maintained in good working order and tested quarterly. I remembered seeing a generator behind the clubhouse during the meeting. Most of the HOA business was conducted from an office inside the clubhouse, including their computer systems with all the homeowner files. If they had a backup generator, it was probably there to keep those systems running during power outages. An idea started forming in my mind. It was petty. It was probably a little vindictive, but it was also perfectly within my rights as a homeowner. I grabbed my camera and walked down to the clubhouse. The generator was housed in a wooden enclosure behind the building, about 50 yards from the parking lot. I walked around the enclosure, taking photographs from different angles. The enclosure itself was well built, but it had large ventilation openings on all sides. Through those openings, I could clearly see the generator inside, a large industrial unit that probably cost tens of thousands of dollars. I walked around to the side of the clubhouse and took more photos. From this angle, I could see propane tanks, 2 of them. Large commercial-grade cylinders, each probably holding 100 pounds or more. They were connected to the generator with copper lines and regulators, and they were completely visible from the side street that ran past the clubhouse. I smiled for the first time in 2 weeks. When I got home, I drafted my own violation notice. I used the exact format and language that the HOA had used on my notice. I changed the address to the clubhouse location and detailed the violation: unauthorized placement of propane tanks visible from street. Per HOA Covenant Section 4.7, all utility equipment must be screened from public view. I printed it on orange paper to match the notices I had received. Then I drove back to the clubhouse and taped it to the front door. I did not expect it to accomplish anything official. The HOA could not cite itself for violations, but I wanted to make a point. If my tiny grill propane tank was a violation, then their massive commercial tanks certainly were too. 3 days later, I received my official response from the board regarding my fine. They had denied my appeal. The letter stated that their records showed proper notice had been given, and my compliance issues remained unresolved. I now owed $750, due within 30 days, or the matter would be turned over to collections and a lien would be placed on my property. I read the letter twice, feeling my blood pressure rise. They were actually going to pursue this, over a propane tank and some trash bins. Fine. If they wanted to play this game, I was ready. I consulted with a real estate attorney in Atlanta named Marcus Webb. His office was in a high rise in Midtown, and his consultation fee was $200. I brought all my documentation, the violation notices, my photographs, copies of the covenants, and my research on Georgia HOA law. Marcus listened to my story, occasionally asking questions and making notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "Classic HOA overreach," he said. "I see this kind of thing all the time. The problem is that fighting it can cost more than just paying the fine. I'm not paying for a violation I was never properly warned about. I understand the principle, but legal fees add up quickly. If you want to take this to court, you're looking at several $1,000s minimum, and there's no guarantee you'll win. Judges tend to side with HOAs unless there's clear evidence of wrongdoing." "What about the selective enforcement angle?" "I have photos of board members with their own violations." Marcus nodded. "That's your strongest argument. Selective enforcement can be grounds for invalidating fines, but you'd need to prove discriminatory intent, which is difficult. They'll just claim they haven't gotten around to those other violations yet. So what do I do? You have a few options. Pay the fine and move on. Request mediation with the HOA, or fight it in court and hope the judge sees things your way. There's also the nuclear option." "What's that?" "Run for the HOA board yourself. If enough homeowners are unhappy with how things are being run, organize a vote to recall the current board and elect new members. It's allowed under most HOA bylaws." I had not considered that possibility. "How would that work?" Marcus explained the process. According to standard HOA procedures, homeowners could petition for a special election to recall board members. It required signatures from 20% of the homeowners. If successful, a vote would be held and homeowners could elect new leadership. "The problem is," Marcus continued, "most people don't want to put in the time and effort required to serve on an HOA board. That's how people like your Patricia Tennyson end up in power for years. Nobody challenges them." I left Marcus's office with a lot to think about. $750 suddenly seemed like a small price to pay to make this headache go away. But the more I thought about it, the more the principle mattered. This was not just about me anymore. I had seen the other homeowners at that meeting, all dealing with similar heavy-handed enforcement. Someone needed to stand up to this. That evening, I drafted a letter to every homeowner in Meadowbrook Heights. I detailed my experience with the HOA, including the unwarranted fines and the selective enforcement. I included photographs of the board members' own violations. I explained the recall process and invited anyone interested to a meeting at my house the following Saturday. I printed 200 copies and spent the next 2 days walking around the neighborhood, placing a letter in every mailbox. Several people stopped me to ask what I was doing, and I gave them the short version of my story. Most nodded sympathetically. A few shared their own HOA horror stories. By the time Saturday arrived, I was not sure what to expect. Maybe 5 people would show up. Maybe nobody would. I had bought some cookies from the grocery store and made coffee, trying to make my living room welcoming for potential co-conspirators. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 p.m. I opened the door to find a man in his 40s with graying hair and a tired expression. "David Park," he said, extending his hand. "I got your letter. I'm very interested in talking about the HOA. Come in, please." David was followed by a steady stream of neighbors. By 2:15, I had 23 people crammed into my living room, sitting on every available surface and standing along the walls. Some I recognized from the board meeting. Others I had never seen before. I introduced myself and thanked everyone for coming. Then I opened the floor for people to share their experiences. David went first. I've lived here for 5 years. The HOA has fined me more than $3,000 in that time. Grass too long. Mailbox faded. Holiday decorations up past the deadline. Weeds in my flower bed. Last year they tried to fine me for having my car parked in my driveway overnight because they said it was a work vehicle. I drive a Honda Civic. A woman named Susan raised her hand. They made me repaint my entire house because they said the color was not an approved shade. I spent $8,000. When I compared my color to the approved list, it was identical. They said it looked different in person. More stories followed. A couple named Tom and Lisa had been fined for replacing their roof shingles with a slightly different shade after storm damage. A retired man named George was being harassed about his yard maintenance, despite paying a professional service. A single mother named Rachel was facing fines for having a play set in her backyard that was allegedly too close to the fence line. Everyone had a story. Everyone was frustrated. And everyone was angry at Patricia Tennyson specifically. Her name came up again and again as the source of most violation notices. "So what can we do?" Susan asked. "I can't afford to keep fighting these fines." I explained the recall process that Marcus had told me about. "We need signatures from 20% of homeowners to trigger a special election. There are 187 houses in the subdivision, so we need at least 38 signatures. Then, we can hold a vote to replace the current board with new members who will enforce the rules fairly." "Who would run the new board?" David asked. "We would need to nominate candidates, people who are willing to serve and who want to change how things are run around here." There was silence as people absorbed this. Running for HOA board was not glamorous. It was unpaid work dealing with neighborhood disputes and administrative tasks. But someone had to do it. "I'll run," David said. "I'm sick of this nonsense." "I'll run too," Susan added. "I work from home, so I have time to actually do the job right." 2 more people volunteered, George and a younger woman named Amy who had recently moved in. That gave us 4 candidates for 5 board positions. I reluctantly raised my own hand to make 5. Over the next week, we collected signatures. I created a simple petition form explaining that we were requesting a special election to recall the current board. Every person I approached had heard about the meeting or had received my letter. Most signed willingly. A few declined, saying they did not want to get involved in neighborhood politics. One person, an older woman named Margaret, told me that Patricia had done a good job and I was causing trouble. But within 10 days, we had 67 signatures. More than enough. I submitted the petition to the HOA office in person. Brenda accepted it with a neutral expression and said she would forward it to the board for review. "They have to schedule the election within 45 days, I told her. "That's in the bylaws. I'm aware of the procedures, Mr. Vaughn." 2 days later, I received a letter from Patricia Tennyson in her capacity as board president. It was not about the recall petition. It was informing me that my unpaid fine of $750 had been turned over to the HOA's collection attorney, and legal action would be initiated if payment was not received within 15 days. I called Marcus Webb. "Can they do this while we're in the middle of a recall process?" "Unfortunately, yes. The 2 issues are separate. Your fine is still outstanding regardless of what happens with the board election." This feels like retaliation. It probably is, but proving that is difficult. My advice is to pay the fine under protest. You can sue to get it back later if you want, once you have new board leadership. I hated the idea of giving them any money, but I also did not want a legal judgment against me. I wrote a check for $750 and mailed it to the HOA office with a letter stating that I was paying under protest and reserved all rights to challenge the fine. The next board meeting was scheduled for May 14th. According to the bylaws, they had to address the recall petition at that meeting. I made sure to arrive early with David, Susan, George, and Amy. We sat together in the front row, a united front. Patricia called the meeting to order with her usual efficiency. She went through the regular agenda items, clearly trying to delay the inevitable. Finally, 45 minutes into the meeting, she addressed the petition. The board has received a request for a special election to recall the current board members, she said, her voice tight. We have reviewed the petition and found several irregularities. I sat up straighter. This was not going to be good. First, several of the signatures appear to be illegible or incomplete. Second, some of the signers are not current on their HOA assessments, which disqualifies them from participating in official association business. Third, there are questions about whether proper procedures were followed in collecting these signatures. I stood up. Those are all fabrications. Every signature was collected legally from homeowners in good standing. If there are questions about specific signatures, we're happy to verify them. Mr. Vaughn, please sit down. You're out of order. I'm a homeowner with a right to speak at this meeting. You're inventing reasons to reject a valid recall petition. Karen Whitmore leaned into her microphone. We're not inventing anything. The board has a responsibility to ensure that all association business is conducted properly. We need time to verify these signatures. The bylaws say you have to schedule an election within 45 days of receiving a valid petition, David said, standing up next to me. You don't get unlimited time to verify signatures. Patricia's face was red now. This meeting is getting out of hand. We're going to take a short recess. She and the other board members stood and walked out of the room, leaving the 30 or so homeowners in attendance murmuring among themselves. The recess lasted 20 minutes. When the board returned, Patricia had apparently consulted with someone, probably the HOA's attorney. After further review, she announced, the board will accept the recall petition. The special election will be held on June 25th, 42 days from now. Nominations for new board candidates must be submitted by June 1st. Any homeowner in good standing can run. It was not the outright rejection I had feared, but it was clear Patricia was not going down without a fight. The 42-day timeline gave her plenty of time to campaign and try to maintain her position. Over the next several weeks, the neighborhood became divided. Patricia and her supporters put up signs at the subdivision entrances declaring, "Keep Meadowbrook Heights beautiful," and "Support your current board." They sent out mailers highlighting all the improvements made during Patricia's tenure. New playground equipment, resurfaced tennis courts, upgraded pool facilities. Our group countered with our own campaign focused on fair enforcement and reasonable governance. We held yard sign parties where people could pick up signs saying, "Time for change" and "Fair, HOA now." We created a Facebook group for residents to share their experiences and ask questions about the candidates. The neighborhood had never been so engaged with HOA politics. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion. Longtime residents who had never attended a board meeting were showing up to candidate forums. People were debating HOA policy at the neighborhood pool. Through all of this, I kept an eye on the clubhouse. The orange violation notice I had posted about the propane tanks was still on the door, faded now but visible. Nobody had moved the tanks or built any screening for them. The hypocrisy was stark. Then, on June 3rd, something unexpected happened. I was working from home when I heard sirens in the neighborhood. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles raced past my house, heading toward the clubhouse. I grabbed my phone and followed on foot. When I arrived, 3 fire trucks were parked at the clubhouse along with an ambulance and several police cars. Firefighters in full gear were examining the generator enclosure behind the building. A small crowd of residents had gathered to watch. I spotted David in the crowd. What happened? Not sure. Someone said there was a gas leak. We watched as the firefighters used detection equipment around the generator and propane tanks. After about 30 minutes, the fire chief talked with one of his crew members, then approached the small crowd. "We've shut off the propane supply as a precaution," he announced. "There's no active leak, but the setup here is not up to code. The tanks are too close to the structure and the ventilation is insufficient. This is a commercial generator installation and it needs to meet commercial standards. We're going to have to red tag this until it's brought into compliance." I caught David's eye. The propane tanks, the ones that violated the HOA's own rules about utility equipment being visible from the street. Now they were also apparently a safety hazard. The fire chief posted a large red notice on the generator enclosure declaring it unsafe for operation. The clubhouse itself remained open, but without the backup generator, they would have no power during any outages. As the fire trucks left, I saw Patricia's silver Mercedes pull into the parking lot. She got out and marched over to the fire chief before he could leave. I was too far away to hear their conversation, but her body language was clear. She was not happy. After the fire chief drove away, Patricia went into the clubhouse. I decided this was a good time to check in with Brenda. I walked into the office to find Patricia and Karen in a heated discussion with Brenda. "We need to get this fixed immediately," Patricia was saying. "The annual budget meeting is next week, and we can't have the computers go down. The fire department said it has to be brought up to code," Brenda replied. "That means moving the tanks and rebuilding the enclosure. The board will have to approve the expense." "How much are we talking about?" Karen asked. "At least $15,000, maybe more." That was when Patricia noticed me standing in the doorway. "Can we help you, Mr. Vaughn? Just checking on when we'll get our voter information for the special election," I said innocently. "It's only 3 weeks away." Patricia's expression could have curdled milk. "Brenda will be mailing that out next week. If there's nothing else, we're in the middle of a private board discussion." "About the generator?" I asked. "I couldn't help but overhear. It's too bad about the propane tanks being out of compliance. Though I guess they were already in violation of Section 4.7 about utility equipment being visible from the street. Same rule I was fined for." The room went very quiet. "That's different," Karen finally said. "That's HOA equipment for essential services." I don't see any exception in the covenants for HOA equipment. In fact, Section 12.8 says HOA infrastructure should be maintained in good working order, which would include following the same rules everyone else has to follow. Patricia stepped toward me. "Are you responsible for this? Did you report our generator to the fire department?" "I didn't report anything. But I did post a violation notice about those tanks being visible from the street about 6 weeks ago. I guess someone saw it and got concerned enough to call the fire department." It was a stretch of the truth, but not technically a lie. I had posted the notice. I had no idea if that was related to the fire department inspection, but I was willing to let Patricia think it was. "This is harassment," Patricia said. "You're sabotaging HOA property because you're angry about a legitimate fine." I moved a propane tank that was barely visible and got fined $750. The HOA has 2 huge commercial propane tanks that are completely visible from the street, connected to equipment that the fire department says is not up to code. I'm just pointing out the inconsistency. Brenda, who had been watching this exchange with wide eyes, spoke up. "Mrs. Tennyson, Perhaps we should consult with the HOA attorney about this." "That's exactly what we're going to do," Patricia said. She turned back to me. "Get out of this office, Mr. Vaughn, now." I left, feeling a mix of satisfaction and nervousness. I had not actually done anything wrong, but I had definitely poked the bear. Patricia was going to come after me even harder now. Sure enough, 3 days later I received a new violation notice. This time it was for excessive noise disturbance, because I had allegedly been playing loud music late at night. I had done no such thing. I rarely played music at all and never late at night. This was pure retaliation. I documented the false violation and added it to my growing file of evidence against the board. At this point, I had enough material to show a clear pattern of harassment. The candidate forum was held on June 15th at the clubhouse. All 10 candidates were present. The 5 current board members seeking to retain their seats and our slate of 5 challengers. About 80 residents attended, filling the available seating and standing along the walls. A neutral moderator, a local attorney named Mr. Harris, who was not a resident of our subdivision, asked questions of each candidate. The questions covered typical HOA issues: budget management, rule enforcement, communication with residents, and long-term planning for the neighborhood. Patricia gave polished answers about maintaining property values and preserving the character of Meadowbrook Heights. She emphasized her 6 years of experience and the various improvements made under her leadership. When it was my turn to answer questions, I focused on fair and consistent enforcement of rules. "Every homeowner should be held to the same standards," I said. "That includes board members. If we have rules about propane tanks being screened from view, those rules should apply to the HOA's own equipment just as much as they apply to a homeowner's grill tank. Nobody should be above the covenants." That got applause from several people in the audience. Karen tried to defend the board's record. "We have an obligation to enforce the covenants to protect everyone's property values. Sometimes that means making unpopular decisions, but those decisions are made fairly and consistently based on the rules." "Then why do multiple board members have violations at their own homes?" David asked from his seat. "I've documented at least one covenant violation at each current board member's property. Why haven't those been cited?" Douglas Miller shifted uncomfortably. "If there are legitimate violations, they should be reported through the proper channels." "They were reported," I said. "I submitted a list of violations 6 weeks ago. Nothing has been done about any of them." The forum continued for 2 hours. By the end, the lines were clearly drawn. Patricia and her board represented the old guard, the by-the-book enforcement of every minor rule. Our group represented a more balanced approach, focusing on major issues and consistent application of standards. On June 20th, 5 days before the election, the power went out in our neighborhood. A storm had rolled through Atlanta, bringing lightning and high winds. Trees came down across several streets, taking power lines with them. Georgia Power estimated it would take 12 to 18 hours to restore electricity. I was sitting in my dark living room with Max, listening to updates on my phone when I heard more sirens. Police cars this time, heading toward the clubhouse. I grabbed a flashlight and walked down there. The parking lot was full of emergency vehicles. Police cars, an ambulance, and fire trucks again. The clubhouse itself was dark, and I could see flashlight beams moving around inside through the windows. I found a police officer near the entrance. "What's going on?" "We got a call about someone breaking into the building," the officer said. "But it looks like the alarm system is malfunctioning because of the power outage. Doesn't the clubhouse have a backup generator? If it does, it's not working." Of course it was not working. The fire department had red-tagged it 3 weeks ago, and apparently the HOA had not yet fixed the problem. Without backup power, the clubhouse's security system and computers were offline. And without those computers, the HOA could not access resident records, financial information, or any of the digital files they maintained. I watched as the police searched the building and determined there was no actual break-in. The alarm had been triggered by the power failure, and without the backup generator, the system had defaulted to a fail-safe mode that summoned emergency services. Patricia arrived about 20 minutes later. Even by flashlight, I could see the fury on her face. She talked with the police and then disappeared into the dark clubhouse with Brenda and Karen. The next morning, power was restored to the neighborhood. I checked the HOA Facebook group and found a notice from Brenda. Due to technical difficulties during yesterday's power outage, some HOA computer files may have been corrupted. We are working to restore all data from backups. Please be patient as we resolve these issues. I called David. Did you see the notice about their computer problems? Yeah, sounds like they lost data when the power went out. Without a functioning backup generator, they had no protection. Their whole system probably crashed. Couldn't happen to a nicer group of people, David said dryly. The election was held on Saturday, June 25th. Voting took place at the clubhouse from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Every homeowner in good standing could vote for up to 5 candidates. The top 5 vote-getters would make up the new board. I voted early, then spent the day nervously trying to distract myself. I cleaned my house, took Max for a long walk, and tried to read a book. Nothing held my attention. This election would determine not just whether I could resolve my ridiculous fine, but whether the entire neighborhood could escape Patricia's heavy-handed rule. At 7 p.m., the votes were tallied by Mr. Harris, the attorney who had moderated the candidate forum, along with 2 other neutral observers. At 8 p.m., the results were posted. David Park received 132 votes. Susan Collins received 128 votes. Peter Vaughn, I received 122 votes. George Martinez received 118 votes. Amy Chen received 115 votes. Patricia Tennyson received 98 votes. Karen Whitmore received 93 votes. Douglas Miller received 87 votes. Richard Stone received 79 votes. Jennifer Park received 74 votes. We had done it. The entire board had been replaced. All 5 of the previous board members had lost their seats. The clubhouse erupted in cheers from our supporters. People hugged and shook hands. Someone popped a bottle of champagne that they had brought just in case. David grabbed my shoulder and squeezed. We did it, man. We actually did it. Patricia stood near the vote tally board, staring at the numbers as if she could will them to change through sheer force of personality. Karen was crying. The other former board members looked shell-shocked. Mr. Harris called for order. The new board will be sworn in at an official ceremony to be held within 2 weeks. Until then, the previous board retains authority for any essential HOA business. Patricia composed herself and walked out without a word. The rest of the former board members followed her. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. The next 2 weeks were busy. David, Susan, George, Amy, and I met several times to plan our transition. We wanted to make immediate changes but had to wait until we were officially sworn in and had legal authority. Our first priority was reviewing all outstanding fines and violations. We wanted to establish a clear, fair enforcement policy that would apply equally to everyone. Our second priority was fixing the generator situation. Without backup power, the clubhouse and all its systems were vulnerable during outages. Our third priority was reviewing the HOA budget and looking for ways to reduce unnecessary expenses while maintaining the neighborhood effectively. The swearing-in ceremony was held on July 10th. Mr. Harris administered the oaths, and we officially became the Meadowbrook Heights HOA Board of Directors. David was elected president by the board. Susan became vice president. I took on the role of secretary, primarily because I had the most organized records of everything that had happened over the past few months. Our first official act was to vote on a resolution establishing new enforcement procedures. All homeowners would receive a written warning for first-time violations, with photographic evidence and a clear explanation of the issue. Warnings would include a reasonable timeline for compliance. Only after non-compliance with the warning would fines be assessed. And most importantly, board members would be held to the same standards as all other homeowners. The resolution passed unanimously. Our second act was to review all fines assessed in the past year. We identified dozens of cases where homeowners had been fined without proper warning, or for violations that were being selectively enforced. We voted to refund all fines where proper procedures had not been followed. That meant I would get my $750 back. So would dozens of other homeowners. Our third act was to address the generator situation. We got 3 bids for bringing the system up to code. The work included moving the propane tanks to a compliant location, rebuilding the enclosure with proper ventilation, and ensuring all safety systems were correctly installed. We accepted the lowest bid of $13,800 and authorized the work to begin immediately. We also voted to build proper screening around the new tank location so they would not be visible from the street. We figured we should practice what we preached. Over the next several weeks, we worked through a backlog of HOA business that had been neglected. Maintenance requests that had been ignored were addressed. Budget line items that seemed questionable were investigated. We discovered that Patricia had been paying the HOA attorney $300 an hour to attend every board meeting, even when legal advice was not needed. We changed that policy immediately. We also discovered that several of Patricia's family members had been hired as contractors for HOA work at rates above market value. A landscaping company owned by her brother-in-law had been paid 40% more than competing bids. We rebid those contracts and saved the HOA thousands of dollars annually. The more we dug into the previous board's operations, the more problems we found. It was not outright fraud, but it was nepotism and favoritism that had cost the homeowners money while enriching Patricia's network. In mid-August, I was working in my home office when my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Patricia Tennyson standing on my porch. She looked different from the polished woman I had first met at the board meeting. She seemed smaller somehow, diminished. "Mrs. Tennyson, what can I do for you?" "I wanted to talk to you. May I come in?" I hesitated, then stepped aside. She entered and I led her to the living room. Max came over to investigate and Patricia absently petted his head. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "I was wrong about how I handled your violation and many others. I let my desire to maintain control of the neighborhood override my judgment." I was not sure what to say. This was the last thing I had expected. When I first became HOA president 6 years ago, I genuinely wanted to help the neighborhood, Patricia continued. Property values were declining. People were letting their homes deteriorate. I thought strict enforcement of the covenants would fix everything. And for a while, it worked. Values went up. The neighborhood looked better. But somewhere along the way, I stopped caring about helping people and started caring about being in charge, about being right. She paused, looking down at her hands. Your propane tank was barely visible. The fine was excessive. And targeting you specifically after you complained was vindictive. I convinced myself I was protecting the neighborhood, but really I was just protecting my ego. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm moving. My husband got a job opportunity in North Carolina, and we're leaving next month. I wanted to clear the air before I go, and I wanted to tell you that I think you and the new board are doing a good job. The changes you have made are fair and reasonable. The neighborhood is in better hands now. She stood up. I also wanted to tell you that the generator situation was not your fault. After the fire department inspection, I should have fixed it immediately. But I was so angry at you for pointing out the violation that I dragged my feet on approving the repair budget. When the power went out and we lost data, that was on me, not you. I appreciate you saying that, I said. For what it is worth, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you lost perspective. It happens. She smiled sadly. That's generous of you. I hope your new board does better than I did. And I hope you enjoy living here. It really is a great neighborhood when it's not being run by someone on a power trip. After she left, I sat on my couch for a long time, processing the conversation. In my anger over the fines and the harassment, I had built Patricia up in my mind as this terrible villain. But she was just a person who had made mistakes. She had let a little bit of power corrupt her judgment, and when challenged, she had dug in instead of admitting error. I respected her for coming to apologize. It could not have been easy. By September, the neighborhood had settled into a new normal under the new board's leadership. Complaints and violation notices decreased dramatically. When issues did arise, they were handled with communication and reasonableness rather than immediate fines. The generator was fully repaired and operational, properly screened from view and up to code. When we had a power outage in late September, the system worked perfectly, keeping the clubhouse computers and security system online. We held monthly open office hours where any homeowner could come talk to board members about concerns. The meetings were actually productive instead of being showcases for board authority. Property values continued to rise, not because of strict enforcement of minor rules, but because people genuinely enjoyed living in a neighborhood with reasonable governance. My own situation was fully resolved. My fine was refunded along with interest. The false noise violation was expunged from my record. My propane tank remained in my backyard where I had moved it, and I had no interest in moving it back to the side of the house. The whole ordeal had taught me that sometimes the principle matters more than the inconvenience. I kept detailed records of everything that had happened, from that first orange notice on my door to the election, results to Patricia's final apology. Some people suggested I write a book about it. Maybe someday I would. For now, I was content to serve out my term on the HOA board, helping to keep the neighborhood running smoothly while treating people fairly. It was not glamorous work, but it mattered. David turned out to be an excellent board president. He was organized and fair-minded, and he had a gift for diffusing tense situations with humor. Susan managed the finances with precision, finding savings and ensuring the HOA's money was spent wisely. George oversaw maintenance and improvements, finally addressing repair requests that had languished for years. Amy handled communications, keeping residents informed through newsletters and social media. Together, we made a good team. One evening in October, I was grilling in my backyard when David stopped by with a 6-pack of beer. We sat on my patio watching the sun set, talking about upcoming projects the HOA was planning. You ever think about what would have happened if you had just paid that first fine? David asked. Sometimes. I'd be $750 poorer, and Patricia would still be running the neighborhood like her personal fiefdom. The propane tank thing was petty on your part, David said, pointing out their generator violations. Completely petty, I agreed. But sometimes petty is what it takes to make a point. Their backup generator quit, the power went out, they lost data, and it led to Patricia looking incompetent right before the election. All because you moved your propane tank and they refused to address their own violations. Karma has a sense of humor, David laughed. That it does. We sat in comfortable silence, sipping our beer as the sky turned from orange to purple. Max sprawled at our feet, content in the way dogs are when their people are happy. Thanks for pushing back on all this, David said. I had been thinking about challenging the board for 2 years, but I never had the courage to actually do it. You showed up, got angry about a propane tank, and made it happen. I just wanted them to leave me alone about my grill, and you ended up starting a revolution. A very small suburban revolution. Still counts. He was right. It did count. Not in any grand historical sense, but in the daily lives of the 187 families living in Meadowbrook Heights. They now had an HOA that served them rather than ruling them. That mattered. As autumn progressed into winter, life in the neighborhood continued peacefully. The holidays came and went without anyone being fined for having their decorations up too long. People decorated their homes with enthusiasm, knowing they would not face harassment for choosing the wrong shade of white lights. In January, we held our first annual meeting under the new board. Nearly every homeowner attended, a stark contrast to previous years when attendance had been minimal. We presented the budget, discussed upcoming projects, and opened the floor for questions and suggestions. It was democracy in action. Messy and imperfect but genuine. People disagreed about priorities and expressed frustration about various issues. But they were heard, and they knew their input mattered. That made all the difference. One of the homeowners, Tom, suggested we create a neighborhood improvement fund where homeowners could contribute money specifically for projects beyond basic maintenance. The idea was approved enthusiastically, and within a month, we had raised enough to renovate the playground with new equipment. Another homeowner, Lisa, proposed a neighborhood newsletter highlighting residents and their achievements. Amy volunteered to manage it, and the first issue came out in February. It featured a retired teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years, a young couple who had just had twins, and a teenager who had earned a college scholarship. It helped build community in a way that violation notices never could. In March, almost a year after I first received that orange notice about my propane tank, I attended a board meeting where we reviewed the year's enforcement statistics. We had issued 63 warnings for various violations. Of those, 58 had been resolved through communication and cooperation. Only 5 had progressed to fines, and those were for homeowners who had refused multiple attempts at resolution. Compare that to the previous year under Patricia's board, when they had issued over 200 fines with minimal warnings. We had proven that an HOA could maintain standards without being tyrannical. That rules could be enforced fairly without harassing homeowners. That governance could be effective without being oppressive. It should not have been revolutionary. It should have been common sense. But in the world of homeowners associations, common sense was often in short supply. As my first term on the board was approaching its midpoint, I reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. A year ago, I was a new homeowner just trying to grill some burgers without HOA drama. Now, I was part of the leadership team for an entire neighborhood, helping to make decisions that affected hundreds of people. The irony was not lost on me. I had never wanted to be on an HOA board. The whole situation had been forced on me by Patricia's unreasonable fine. But now that I was here, I found the work meaningful. Not exciting, certainly. HOA board meetings would never be anyone's idea of a good time, but meaningful in the way that civic engagement always is, even at the most local level. Max was lying at my feet as I typed up minutes from our latest meeting. He looked up at me with his usual adoring expression, completely unconcerned with HOA politics or propane tank placement regulations. Dogs had the right idea about what mattered in life. My phone buzzed with a text from Susan. Generator test successful. All systems working perfectly. We had implemented quarterly testing of the backup generator, as the covenants required, but the previous board had never actually done. Each time we ran the test, I thought about that chain of events that had started with my propane tank and ended with their system failing during a power outage. It had been the perfect storm of petty rules enforcement, selective application, and bureaucratic incompetence. And it had changed everything. I sometimes wondered what Patricia thought about it all from her new home in North Carolina. Did she regret her years of strict enforcement? Did she understand how much damage she had done to the community spirit of the neighborhood? Or did she still think she had been right and everyone else had been wrong? I would probably never know. She had moved away and, as far as I knew, had no contact with anyone in Meadowbrook Heights. Her house had sold quickly to a young family with 3 kids. They were delightful neighbors who had already contributed to the community in ways Patricia never had. In April, exactly 1 year after my propane tank saga began, the board held a neighborhood barbecue at the clubhouse. We rented a massive grill and bought enough food for everyone. Families came out, kids played on the renovated playground, and adults talked and laughed in the spring sunshine. David and I manned the grill, cooking hamburgers and hot dogs for the crowd. At one point, he nudged me and pointed to the propane tanks we were using. They were commercial-size cylinders, similar to the ones that had caused so much trouble for the HOA's generator. "Think we need to screen those from view?" he asked with a grin. "Probably. Wouldn't want to violate Section 4.7. We both laughed. The absurdity of the whole situation had become a running joke among those of us who had been through it. But underneath, the humor was a serious point. Rules needed to be reasonable, fairly applied, and proportionate to actual concerns. A propane tank that was barely visible from the street was not hurting anyone. Fining someone $750 for it was not protecting property values. It was just petty authoritarianism. As the barbecue wound down and families headed home, I looked around at the neighborhood. Kids on bikes riding down the street, couples walking dogs, people sitting on their porches enjoying the evening. This was what a community should look like. Relaxed, welcoming, comfortable, not perfect. There were still disputes and disagreements. Some homeowners thought we were too lenient with enforcement. Others wanted even more flexibility. We had to balance competing interests and make decisions that would inevitably disappoint someone, but we were trying to be fair. We were listening to people. We were treating homeowners with respect instead of suspicion. And that made all the difference. That evening, as I sat on my own porch with Max beside me, I thought about the journey from that first violation notice to this moment. It had been frustrating, infuriating, time-consuming, and expensive. I had spent hundreds of hours dealing with HOA issues when I would rather have been doing almost anything else. But I had also learned valuable lessons about standing up for what was right, organizing people around a common cause, and the importance of good governance even at the most local level. I had made friends with neighbors I might never have met otherwise. I had contributed to making my community better, all because of a propane tank. Sometimes life's most significant moments came from the most mundane circumstances. A violation notice over a grill tank had led to a complete change in neighborhood leadership. A petty fine had sparked a movement. An overreaching HOA president had been replaced by a board committed to fair enforcement. The backup generator that had failed during the power outage was now working perfectly, properly maintained and tested regularly. The propane tanks that fueled it were screened from view and up to code. The HOA's systems were secure and backed up properly. All the things that should have been done correctly from the beginning were now in place. And my own small propane tank, the one that had started everything, sat quietly in my backyard, fueling occasional weekend grilling sessions and causing no trouble whatsoever. As the sun set over Meadowbrook Heights on this April evening, exactly 1 year since the beginning of my HOA adventure, I felt a sense of contentment. Not because everything was perfect, but because things were better. The neighborhood had been through upheaval and come out stronger. People had engaged with local governance and made positive changes. A bad system had been reformed by people who cared enough to do something about it. My phone buzzed with another message from David. "Good barbecue today. Same time next year," I typed back. "Definitely. I'll bring the propane." Even through text, I could sense his laughter. The story of how an HOA fined me for propane tank placement, so I moved it and their backup generator quit, had become neighborhood legend. New residents heard about it and asked questions. Kids probably would grow up with exaggerated versions of the tale. The basic facts would get embellished over time until it became a mythical story of neighborhood rebellion. But at its core, it would always be about one simple truth. Systems designed to help people must be administered by people who actually want to help. When governance becomes about power and control rather than service and support, it corrupts itself. And when that happens, ordinary citizens have both the right and the responsibility to demand better. I had demanded better. And through a combination of persistence, organization, a little bit of luck, and yes, some strategic pettiness about propane tank violations, we had achieved it. Meadowbrook Heights was not just a subdivision anymore. It was a real community, governed by people who lived here and cared about their neighbors. The HOA was no longer a source of fear and frustration, but a functioning system that served its intended purpose. All because I refused to pay an unfair fine for a propane tank, stood up for what was right, and convinced enough neighbors to join me in demanding change. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance lead to the biggest transformations. Sometimes refusing to accept bureaucratic overreach sparks a movement. And sometimes, just sometimes, pointing out the hypocrisy of an HOA's propane tank violations leads to their backup generator failing at exactly the right moment to expose their incompetence. Life has a funny way of working out, especially when you are willing to fight for what is fair. As I sat there on my porch, watching the last light fade from the sky, I raised my beer in a silent toast to propane tanks, backup generators, and the power of community organizing. Max wagged his tail, perhaps sensing my good mood. I scratched his ears and stood up, ready to go inside and start another week of work, board meetings, and the daily routines of suburban life. But now those routines included the satisfaction of knowing I had made a difference. That I had stood up to unjust authority and won. That my neighborhood was better because I had refused to simply pay that fine and move on. The orange violation notice that had started it all was framed on my office wall now, a reminder of how small things can lead to big changes. Beneath it, I had added the receipt for my refunded fine and a photograph from election night showing the vote tally. Together, They told a story. A very suburban, very American story about homeowners associations, power struggles, and the importance of good governance. It was not dramatic or glamorous. Nobody would make a movie about it. But for the 187 families of Meadowbrook Heights, it was the story of how their neighborhood transformed from a place of petty rules and excessive fines into a genuine community, where people looked out for each other, and governance served the people rather than controlling them. And it all started with a propane tank. I smiled, turned off the porch light, and went inside to my home in my neighborhood, in my community, where the HOA actually worked the way it was supposed to, where rules were enforced fairly, where board members were accountable, and where backup generators had properly screened propane tanks that met all safety codes. Sometimes justice comes in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes karma has a sense of humor. And sometimes, when you stand up for what is right, even over something as simple as a propane tank, you end up changing everything. The end of the story, but hopefully just the beginning of a better way forward for HOAs everywhere. Or at least one small HOA in suburban Atlanta, where a man named Peter Vaughn once got fined for a propane tank and decided that enough was enough.